good to have everybody with us today. I love the high impact title that we have for this, how to create millions in financial value for staffing agencies with productivity enhancements. That's just creating millions in financial value is a great win for anybody really. And, working here at Prdoscore, we encounter like lots of cool partners and customers and stuff. And Tyler, when we started working with Tyler, it reminded me all the way back in things like 7th grade science, where you study the symbiotic relationship, where it was like, I think the thing they always showed was like the shark with the little fish, attached to it, and how they need each other and stuff. And man, we have a great relationship with Tyler and Gradmore in that he's able to take our data and correlate it to other metrics, financial metrics, and really drive some insights that are super beneficial to our customers and super cool to us. So that's what really we're going to talk about today, and look forward to the discussion. And again, I'm David, the president of Prdoscore. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, big college football fan, Roll Tide, and which is the University of Alabama if you're not a college football fan. And I've been at Prdoscore exactly, I think, a year yesterday. So it's been a fun journey so far, and we're happy to have Tyler with us. So Tyler, why don't you tell us a little bit about Gradmore, because I think what you guys do is really interesting and differentiated.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Gradmore, we're a data analytics consulting firm, but we specialize in providing data-driven financial insight into the workforce. So everything we do is around taking people data like productivity, engagement, hiring data, and correlating that back to financial metrics, right? And what that means is helping businesses understand how those factors within your workforce impact revenue goals, impact financial costs and efficiency. And we do that all with our data analytics approach and correlative work and analysis in the area, right? So our key areas that we'll be discussing, and productivity is a huge focus today, and I'm excited to talk about it. But we also do things around talent acquisition. We also do things around talent retention, because we found that those types of things factor heavily into driving financial value at a company.
Yep. And, Tyler, I travel a lot. And when I travel, I like to have something good to watch on the plane. And I downloaded that Netflix series, Drive to Survive, last year, and I started watching it. And I think there were several other million people that did the same thing, because Formula One interest in the United States has like gone through the roof. And we're, coming up on this Miami F1, where they built this whole F1 track around the Miami stadium. And it's so funny. I don't know if you've seen, Tyler, but they like tried to create like the Monaco deal, but this is inland. So they brought boats out and set them up and painted it. So they're going to have like a section where people can be on boats, but the boats actually aren't in the water.
Yeah, I saw that. Yep, totally.
It's really pretty cool. So, when you and I were talking about this beforehand, we ended up with this kind of Formula One analogy. So I talked through kind of how, we think about stuff and how we can relate it back to the Formula One car here.
Absolutely. So it's a great analogy, because like Miami's, it's coming up in a few days. An F1 has exploded with that series on Netflix. I've watched several episodes. It's super fascinating. And it's very interesting in F1 how everything plays a role into winning performance or driving team performance, right? So from this analogy, you like to think of things in a few ways, right? So first is on the performance side. So in order to win a race, right, certain things need to happen, right? You need to have a great car, right? But to have a great car, what do you need? Really good wheels. You need good brakes. You need an amazing engine, right? And then on top of that, you also need really good talent, right? So the driver needs to be excellent. But if one of those things is off, you tend not to maximize performance, right? You could have a great driver like Lewis Hamilton, but if your car is not running as well, which is what's happening this year for him, then yeah, and then you're not performing at the optimal level, right? But if you have an amazing car, but your driver isn't as effective, you're still not performing. So ideally, what we want to do is make sure that all those things kind of fit into the right pieces, right? So a really good driver, really awesome, car and brakes and all that. And then that ultimately leads to performance. Now, how does that relate back to business, right? So when we think about the car, that really think about, we're talking about something like around workflow, right? So how someone works, the tools that they have, sort of the structure of the company, right? And then when we think about talent, we think about how are we finding the right people, how are we retaining them, how are we making sure they're not leaving? That's what we think about when we terms of, from like a workforce perspective, and then how all that plays into it, right? So when we talk about productivity, which we're going to cover a lot today, we're going to discuss it in 3 areas: performance, workflow, and talent itself, and how productivity sort of interacts and plays into driving that forward, right? right? So the first example I have on that in terms of performance, David, you can kind of flip over if you want to the next slide. Here's a perfect example of how we correlate Prdoscore data. So which David will explain more about what Prdoscore means from like a sort of a scoring perspective, how that's correlated with recruiter billing, right? So that's the first thing when we're looking at analysis, we're kind of trying to understand how does productivity lead to better recruiter performance, right? So in this situation, which is in this example, as you can see in this graph, there's a direct correlation, right, between Prdoscore, productivity, more productive person, better recruiter billing, right? And what we've seen when we've done this analysis is, depending on the organization, you'll see different outcomes, right? So in this organization, it's very top heavy, right? You have a lot of people that are productive, that are producing really well, but then you have this sort of like bottom part where you have these sort of like underperformance around productivity, and that's leading to kind of like less billing, right? So what this initially tells us from a performance perspective is there's something going on where people that are not being productive are not producing at the firm. And we've seen things where we have people on the top right where there's only like 3 people that are way up there who are producing, and then the rest of the team is on the bottom. Or we've seen other things where, it's inversed. So it's really interesting how, by being able to use Prdoscore, we can actually see how productivity data really leads to billing and the different interactions, right?
Yeah.
And with Prdoscore's dashboard, you can kind of see how, it'll show you more about how to top, middle, and bottom performers and what that means. So David can explain more about that. But
before we go to that, though, what's super interesting to me on this, Tyler, that jumped out when I was looking at your slides in advance is some of these people, like towards the right, but in the bottom, they are high activity people that aren't getting the results that you would want from a billing standpoint. So if I was like a manager, these are probably like very frustrated employees to some degree, that they're doing the things, but they're not getting the results. And so it's, Mike on our team talks a lot about will versus skill. So these people definitely have the will, they're putting in the energy, but not getting the results. So as a manager, that gives you great opportunity to go in and say like, hey, here's some strategies that can help you, improve, because they're clearly doing the work. They're just not getting the return on it.
Right. And that's something we've seen with this analysis is there's always a few outliers. And when we dig deeper into the outliers, when we see their breakdown of activity, a lot of times that explains it, right?
Yep.
So we might see someone who is an outlier in terms of like they're very productive, but they don't produce. But a lot of times what they're doing in terms of productivity is not aligning with what leads to revenue. And that's really where there's a distinct separation.
Yeah, it's super interesting to me, and we'll dig deeper into that more as we go forward. And this is, as he was mentioning, the Prdoscore dashboard. And this is where we really would show a company, hey, here's what your employees look like, right? You have 5 of them that are above average, 10 of them that are within average, and 2 that are below average. This is great insight that most of the time people don't get. I think what's interesting is that before the pandemic, people, if you say, hey, how would you measure productivity? They say, oh, we'd kind of walk around the office and you would see that Tyler got here early and Tyler stayed late. And maybe Nadine got here, at 9 and left at 4. So the assumption would be that Tyler was a better employee than Nadine because he got here early and stayed late. But without any data, what you wouldn't have seen is that Tyler was standing in the break room talking Formula One racing all day, and Nadine put her AirPods in and was hammering out work from 9 to 4 with no breaks. And so the loose proxy for productivity was what time someone arrived, what time someone left, but there was no data really driving that. Now, with a tool like Prdoscore, you can get that data and you can make much more informed decisions around, okay, I've got 2 people that are below average. That doesn't mean that you fire them or get rid of them. What it does mean, though, is that you need to have a conversation with them. And it could be that one of them's child was just sent home from a close contact exposure at school, and now it's a little crazy at their house. Or it could be that they're on a project they don't like, or maybe they have a manager that doesn't inspire them, or they have relationship struggles with, or whatever. So it allows you to intervene and find out what's actually going on, and then coach up those employees. Then you look at the 5 that are above average. And right now, what's a super hot topic is burnout. And these 5 employees above average, you might say, bravo, great job. But what really that should do is alarm you a little bit and go really drill into those 5 and find out what's going on here. Are these people working at really a non-sustainable rate? And today, replacement of key employees is so hard in the job market. Is that I just saw a Gartner research recently on the IT space. And if you're in the staffing industry, I'm sure you know this. They said that 76% of IT people, when they accept a new job, had 3 other offers, right? So, I mean, it is a very competitive market. So what you don't want is your top people to burn out and quit. You want to keep them and you want to retain them. So those 5 employees that are above 75, that would be a place like, okay, who are those 5? And I need to go have a conversation with them and see, are they really getting that work-life balance that they need? Are they overburdened? Lots of times your best employees are the ones that do not gripe. So if Tyler is my best guy and I gave him a project and then Nadine gave him a project and somebody else gave him a project and suddenly Tyler's underwater and he's the last guy that's going to come and say like, hey, I can't get this done, I'm underwater, because great employees don't complain. So you don't know that he is frustrated and at the end of his rope until he brings in his 2-week notice. So this is what the dashboard is for. It allows you to more intentionally direct your managerial efforts, who needs to be coached up, and then who needs to be protected from burnout. And it's all presented in this nice little dashboard. The way that we do this is that we tie into the business applications that we issue. So Office 365, Slack, Salesforce, Bullhorn, Indeed, all those things we push out there, and we can pull that activity data in, and then we run it through Google AI ML and spit out a productivity score with our algorithm. So that's the way this data is captured and the way the data is rendered. And so it gives you a nice visibility on what the employees are doing, but in a non-invasive way. So real quick on that, some of our competitive platforms out there will use an agent, where they load an agent on the computer. So maybe Tyler loves live music and he comes in and he turns on a YouTube playlist of his favorite bands in the background and lets that play all day. In an agent-based system, that's going to create a false positive where Tyler's boss is going to call him and say like, hey, why were you on YouTube all day for 8 hours? And he'd be like, oh, I was just listening to music as like background. But that's a false positive. We don't fool with that, right? We only look at the business applications. And so therefore we're keeping it at a level of inspection that employees expect, right? When you sign on with a company, you expect to have no privacy around the business issued applications. You typically sign something to that effect. So we're just pulling that data out and rendering it in a more meaningful way. So as you begin to really kind of take this data and layer it against some other stuff, I mean, Tyler's found some interesting things around what the behaviors tell us about successful employees.
Right. So what we're able to do with the analysis is dig deeper beyond just a Prdoscore, right? So the Prdoscore tells us an overall score of someone's productivity, but because Prdoscore pulls in data from emails, text, Slack, Indeed, LinkedIn activity, we're able to get a full picture of what people are spending time on and what correlates to actual performance, right? So in this situation, here's an example where email send data, right? We're able to look at email sends across all recruiters, for example, right? And in this situation, the top 5 billers at the company, activity-wise on emails, is 2x the top 50% and 3x or more of the bottom 25% in terms of billing, right? So we're able to say, look, people that are active on email at this company are going to driving better revenue. Why? Maybe they're following up more. Maybe they're more active in terms of what they're sending out, right? So we're able to go through each part of the Prdoscore and dig into specific areas and see what correlates to revenue at the firm, or what correlates to more billing as a recruiters at the firm, right? So this really gives you like insight into coaching, right? So if you see someone, look, they're really awesome on the phone, but their email is down, and we know that email drives revenue, figure out a way to coach them to get their emails up. Maybe they're just not following up enough, or maybe they're not doing that. So this gives you that ability to see how much activity they're doing in certain areas and what that is. And we can also break. Yeah.
Oh, real quick. I think that is so important in that places I've worked before, I've had employees come to me and say like, hey, I want to be like, and they fill in the name of the top person. Right. But without data, it's hard to tell them, if you came to me and say, hey, David, I want to be like Nadine, she's the top person, what do I need to do differently? But it's hard just to say, just be more like Nadine. I mean, a lot of times you don't have data, but in this case, there's ways to show tangibly, hey, this is what the top people do. And then they can compare and contrast what they're actually doing versus just kind of this ephemeral, just be better or work harder. It's data driven, which is really, really helpful as a manager.
Exactly. And it also gives them an understanding of time, right? So like if the top 5 people are spending over an hour sending emails and the bottom 25% are spending 20 minutes a day, right? You can just say, look, just allocate an hour to following up, make sure how you're structuring that time. A lot of times it could be the fact that the person just doesn't have it put in their calendar, or they haven't allocated the time and they're just kind of randomly doing it, not thinking about it in terms of like a constructive process. This gives them the ability, because most people want to become a top performer, but maybe they just don't think about how they can get there. And this gives them the data of how I can emulate these top 5 people or better recruiters and what you can do with that.
And I think what's interesting in Tyler, looking at your stuff, is that not all activities are the same value, right? And I think that that's the thing, is like, if we're burning our efforts, are we spending them in the right place? And some of it's pretty counterintuitive, which I think your data reflects here.
Totally. Yeah. So one thing we've noticed is certain activities, and depending on the type of company, certain activities drive revenue versus others. So for example, with this example, you'll see that top 25% recruiters versus the bottom 25% in terms of how they spend their time and from a pie graph, right? So the top 25%, they're only spending 42% of their time within the CRM and like sort of like CRM system, while the bottom 25% is spending 55% of their time in the CRM system, right? That is a distinct difference in terms of how they're allocating time. And then what we also see is that a top 25% recruiter in this example, their phone calls are much higher, their emails sent are higher, and their text messaging is higher, right? And what they're doing is they're not necessarily working more hours. They're just working hours more effectively in the areas that are driving revenue for this company, right? And we see this a lot when we've done this analysis, where there's always 1 or 2 things that are within sort of that, productivity realm that are negative correlations to revenue. So for this example on this company that we did this for, there was a negative correlation between time spent in the CRM and actual revenue. So people that spend more time in the CRM system actually produce less billing for the company, while people that spend, yeah, and it's crazy to think that, right? And then while, someone in the other categories, phone calls and emails, that was what was driving revenue. So how do you, then you could dig deeper and figure out, okay, bottom 25%, what are you doing in the CRM? Why are you spending so much time there? How can we figure out how to cut that down, or how can we reallocate your time to, spending it on LinkedIn or spending it on different activities? So just showing how that activity breakdown is and how that drives value is really important. And then we put this in a frame of like a salary, because it really just shows you how someone's spending their time based on what you're paying them, right? So, if someone's in a CRM, most of their salary is going to CRM that's not driving revenue, and their job is to drive revenue for the company, it's not a good allocation, right?
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Just anecdotally, I'm just curious, like, why do you think the bottom performers spend so much time in CRM? Is it kind of like to justify their existence to some degree, or what do you think it is?
I think it's a lot of it is admin based. I think it's a reliance on campaigns potentially through there, versus maybe like a top performer is gonna, send an email outside of the CRM or spend more time out of it. This is pretty good. This is consistent when we've done this analysis, is there's a CRM sort of negative correlation or flat correlation to revenue. And, I feel like it has to do with just how people are behaving, right? Okay. What I've seen with top performers is, this, when you look at a top 5, when I've done this graph, it even gets less. Sometimes the CRM thing goes down to 33%, which is insane. And you see how that really correlates. So I think it has to do with just what they're spending time on. And then digging deeper. But we've noticed that with every company, there's different things that as to what is happening. So if we did have this analysis with the company, we'll actually be able to dig deeper and be like, okay, let's figure out what this real problem is, or what the real bottleneck is to why people are like, spending time within that tool.
So on the left, you're saying that guy may be doing more direct outreach, whereas the person on the right may be doing more kind of blanket campaigning. Got it. Very interesting. But this is kind of counterintuitive, right? Because every sales leader in every organization is clubbing their team over the head to update their CRM and keep that, current. But the people who kind of live in that, they're not getting, again, in staffing in particular, that's very relationship driven. So if you're very campaign oriented versus direct outreach, I guess that, the data shows that has a negative correlation, which is really interesting. Totally. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong direction on that one. So, one thing about talking about connective tissue inside the company that Prdoscore can provide is the social network, is what we call it. And so who's talking to who, and where are there potential like bottlenecks, or where they're like workflow problems? Not up here, but a place I used to work. If we'd had this, it would have really shown a light on a certain problem where our controller at this company, we had about 250 employees. The controller at the company was a pain to deal with. No one liked talking to the controller. And the accounts payable person, Tracy, was super. Everyone loved working with Tracy. So if you'd seen this social network, and we've replaced names here with numbers, but yours would have names on this. If we had names on here, you would have seen all these C-suite executives talking to Tracy in accounts payable. And you would have been like, what in the world? Why in the world is the C-suite talking to Tracy in accounts payable? Because Tracy was helpful, because she could tell you, where are we with this invoicing, or have we gotten, payment on something, or could she pull some kind of numbers for us? And so the C-suite was skipping the controller and going straight to accounts payable. But Tracy was always behind on getting her actual work done because she was helping all these C-suite people with ad hoc requests. Well, you would see that in a social network. You would have seen that Tracy seemed to be central to what was going on, but it was a workaround past the controller because the controller was a challenge to deal with. So understanding your organization and who's talking to who, how those interactions are going, anyone who's like out on the right side here, this one out by themselves, that's a person that could be disengaged and doesn't feel connected to the company. And maybe they're great, but they're disengaged. Are they a risk to leave or to go somewhere else? Or the person has all the arrows talking to them. Is that person at a risk of getting fed up and saying, holy cow, I can't do this, anymore? So having this visibility around what does your company look like and who's talking to who and how they're interrelating. And do we have that one person who maybe isn't tied to revenue, so we don't see their revenue contribution, but suddenly is like sits at the center of all the things that we do? That's somebody you want to make sure you have a good retention plan with, that you keep them and retain them. So this gives you, not only does the data help, but this gives you a visualization to help understand, how is my company structured? How does it interrelate to one another? One of these for another customer of ours that we've done basically has 4 people in the middle, and then it is an exact wheel all the way around. It is like the most micromanaging structure you can imagine, where every person in the company talks to the 4 people in leadership position, and that's like it. There's very, very little cross functional team conversation. So this helps expose inefficiencies, helps expose choke points, and helps expose potentially burnout and people that feel disengaged from the organization.
Yeah, and just like one point on that is that we can actually dig into the data and figure out, like, okay, within the dense networks, right, or sparse networks, are people talking to this person? Is that actually driving more revenue, right? Is there certain managers, and why that might be, sort of how they manage? Is that team doing better because of how they're structured? And we can actually dig through that data through Prdoscore and figure out, awesome. Okay, are those indicators, right? And that can give even more commentary into what is driving performance, right? Because in the end, ideally, what we're trying to do is figure out, how can we optimize employee performance across the board, right, through productivity, and what is that factor? And using the dense networks for sparse, we're able to then pull that data and show how that might be a factor beyond just a workflow and all that stuff into what drives better billing.
Yeah, so you can take this data and add the actual numbers to it, which from a production standpoint, which is super powerful.
Exactly. Yep. And then the last piece, is the talent piece. And the one thing I like to talk about on talent piece is a lot on retention and turnover. So retention and turnover is always thought of like, okay, recruiting costs, onboarding costs. If someone leaves, replacing them is costly, right? And we always talk about how costly it is. But what we don't realize is actually the productivity loss around talent is really where we start to see problems. And it's not just the productivity cost is not just when the person leaves and you have to hire someone and ramp someone up for 3 months to get them to that level, but also before they leave, where there's like this burnout or slowdown in productivity. So what we're able to do is really understand, if you have a top performer, that's doing really well, and they have like really high billing and their Prdoscore is really high, and then all of a sudden in like the month of June, you start to see like a 10% drop. This is where you might want to start understanding, like, okay, is this person going to turn over? All of a sudden not producing, and you can actually get ahead of that turnover costs, right? So in this situation, I just like to highlight that, understanding that like productivity is a cost and it is a big turnover cost. And any way you could limit that, whether through burnout, sort of like eliminating burnout, or preventing that from happening, is a huge value to the organization, right? Because I know that, especially when I've done this with recruiting firms, hiring and then ramping people up, it takes some time to catch up to that person's level who just left, right? So what we're able to do is really understand how turnover and how burnout and how engagement or disengagement really costs you at the company, and what you can do and what measures you can put in to adjust that, right?
Yep.
And Prdoscore, will show that burnout and show that trend. And David could talk more about that.
And before we jump over there, I think what's interesting about this, 2 things on this that jump out to me, Tyler, is one is I was talking to a guy yesterday who runs an executive staffing recruitment kind of company, and he was saying that some research just came out and it said like if somebody comes in with their 2-week notice and you try to save them, you counter offer them, that only 20% of those people are still there a year later. So
Right.
if you come in and say like, hey, David, I can't do this anymore, I'm out. And then I'm like, oh, no, Tyler, I need you to stay. And I offer you more money to stick around or whatever, that only 20% of those people that you save are still there a year later. So, that idea that you're just kind of putting off the inevitable, is there. So then the question is like, well, how do I get early indicators to make sure that Tyler doesn't come in with the 2-week notice? And now I'm trying to save him, which has a very low likelihood of success. And I feel like that's where our data can point that out, is that we can show you who is burning out, who is working too much, and who's working in a non-sustainable way. And I'll say that one of the interesting things that's really come out since Corona is people before felt like work-life balance was a question, right? Now, people talk more about like work-life separation. So people who weren't working at home before are working at home now. And then work is, the old joke about the goldfish that grows to the size of its container. Work is taking over your whole day. You wake up, you shower, maybe, you come in, you start working, and then, you eat dinner. And then you're like, oh, well, I'll just go back in and check email for a minute. Then it's 3 hours later and you've been working, that late. We have one of our employees who very much is kind of like that, structures her day into like, kind of big chunks and then works again at night. But maybe that's her chosen workflow and she's okay with that. Or maybe she's at risk of like, look, I just have too much to do. I can't do this anymore. Or maybe that on a team, you've had a job requisition that's open and you haven't filled it. And so everyone at that whole team is like working above capacity and you haven't like gotten the relief that you need. So Prdoscore can show you that and show you against prior weeks and against other time periods and against other people in your team. And that level of granularity gives you the ability to say like, hey, look, this Benjamin guy, man, I just don't know if that's sustainable, the level he's been working at, or how come his performance is down 43% from before. He was very productive before and now he's not. Is he mailing it in this week? Or has he already gotten an offer from somewhere else and now he's just, going through the motions, kind of like quit on the job? So having this data allows you this early warning sign to intervene early and to have those conversations early so that you're not stuck in a position of trying to save someone at the end, which we all know has an extremely low likelihood of success.
Oh, and one point about the burnout. So one thing that I've noticed and one thing that really is helpful here is looking at the trend around this. So what we'll see is like with a recruiting agency is let's say the trend is that people are burning out every time after between 6 and the 8 month mark. And I've had this with a client where every time the recruiters would be like doing great, they're really engaged. And then at the 6 month mark, they're disengaged and then they left, before the 8 month mark, right? So once you understand your trends of like, okay, all of a sudden, what is going on? Why are my recruiters always leaving around this point? And you could then pick up that data point and then say, maybe we should put in some sort of strategy where at the 6 month mark, this person gets rewarded, or there's some sort of re-engagement with the person, some sort of check-in. The firm themselves, they were just not really doing that. And it was killing them because they were spending all this time hiring, onboarding all these great people. They were killing it in their second quarter after they were ramped, and then they would just leave. So understanding where turnover occurs at what time period within the sort of their employment allows you now to make adjustments into how you address talent retention and how you address sort of these changes, so you can get ahead of this problem. Because if you know that it's always happening in that like late half of that year, you can get ahead of it so it doesn't happen, right? And then if you're able to save half the people, that's money in the bank, right? So that's a really key point, and that's one thing to look at is like the trends.
Yeah, and one thing we see too is like with high growth companies, a lot of them have moved to that like cohort hiring model where they hire like 20 people at a time and then run them through like a boot camp and then go from there. And measuring the time to productivity of that cohort and comparing and contrasting and saying, not necessarily this is a bad person, but maybe it's something in our onboarding process is not quite right and it takes longer for them to learn, or maybe this person had a mentor, or maybe this person had a friend in the company, whatever. So getting, again, more data-driven view into like, okay, here's kind of the hiring point and this cohort goes forward. What does the productivity look like within that cohort? And what can we do to improve those outcomes? That's a great way to look at this too, from a trending standpoint, particularly in high growth companies that hire a lot of people at the same time.
Absolutely. And we've done stuff where we've tracked cohorts and tracked their sort of their performance and billing. And actually we've done things where even if someone gets their first deal, during a certain time, does that make them more likely to stay longer or become, more likely to be a top performer? So we've done things where we track things like marketing cohorts in terms of like, these people are hiring Q1, how are they tracking? These people are hiring Q2. What does that look like? Oh, we made a change to our, in Q2, when we hired people in Q2, we made a change to our onboarding program versus Q1. Is that making an impact? So we're able to also do that. And we're able to pull in other data around, like you said, hiring sources. Is it because of referrals and different things to give a complete picture into what is driving the performance, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really important to understanding, especially if you're a firm that's doubling in size or hiring a lot of recruiters at one time or over the course of a year. It makes a huge difference in terms of the outcomes that you're expecting. Because if you can hire 20 people in a year, and instead of 3 becoming top performers, 8 middle, and then 5, the other 10 leaving after 6 months, and you flip the script and it's like you got 5 people as top performers, 10 people that are staying longer, and only 5 that are just leaving, and less people leave, like it makes a huge difference revenue wise down the line.
Yep. And then I think as we get here to the final part, data is great, but if it doesn't help you improve your financial results, so what, right? And so I feel like you have a good answer for that.
Totally, yeah. So what we'll do is when we work with Prdoscore, we'll do what's called like a workforce financial assessment. So what does that mean, right? So we'll take Prdoscore data, we'll analyze it in correlation with your financial data, whether it's billing, revenue, and we'll begin to see what those trends are that drive those things, right? So like we said, correlating Prdoscore, correlating the activities, correlating trends in different networks to show what is actually happening with your organization at the current moment, right? So that way you get an initial understanding, okay? And then that gives you that sort of that immediate immediate detail about what's happening from a productivity standpoint and what is actually driving billing at your organization. And you're going to get a good insight into what does. Every single firm or every single time I've done this assessment, it's been a different insight. So it's definitely critical in terms of driving performance.
Yep. And then from a Prdoscore standpoint, lots of times we look at software, you think, oh man, this could be the biggest pain to load. It's going to become shelfware. It's going to take countless meetings in the conference room to figure all this stuff out. Not us. Right. So we load within 15 minutes, super quick. You just need super admin privileges into the business applications. We load quickly, and then we pull back 90 days of data. So you get a full look back of 90 days prior to the onboarding time. So it's not just, when you go live, then you're beginning to collect data. We get the 90 days back. And then Tyler only needs about 2 weeks to go through that to come up with what those assessments really look like. So we do a quick installation. That's not a heavy lift. And then you get results pretty quick because we have such robust data immediately out of the gate. Exactly.
So you get an initial understanding of your organization right away with the Prdoscore tool, and then with the assessment that we do in unison with that. So yeah, so that provides a complete picture right away from the start.
Yep.
And then we'll provide ongoing analytics and reporting. So once you install Prdoscore, and then over time, as you have more data, we'll provide ongoing insights to you from a financial standpoint. So you'll be able to get a complete picture. So those trends I'm talking about in burnout and those things like that, as we have more and more data to work with, you'll begin to get that insight on an ongoing basis from us as well.
Yep. So that's the gist of how I feel like we have a great symbiotic relationship with Tyler over at Gradmore, and how you can take our productivity data and then really tie it into how to get better financial results for your staffing company, which again, these are not abstract things. These are real, tangible, actionable things that can help you improve your financial performance based on the data and the actual performance of your team, which is a whole lot better than I feel like, I guess type of stuff. This is stuff that you can know. And we think that that's really powerful.